All right. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Super excited to have you here to talk about one of the raging topics of the moment, PQLs. And we're going to talk today a little bit about PQLs, and we'll discuss if they are becoming the new MQLs, which is one of the things that we're hearing a lot of people talk about. And yeah, really excited to dive into that topic and potentially like burst a few myths along the way. So hang in there, you're in for a treat. And in terms of maybe like credentials, I've been fortunate enough during my time at Mad Kudu to work with a lot of the leading B2B PLG companies, some of which are featured here. And so today, what I was hoping to do is share a few stories from learnings that I've had along the way working with a lot of these to, I think, make the conversation a little bit more concrete and really go deeply into how these companies have been thinking about PLG, PQLs, how they relate to MQLs, are they replacing them or not? And of course, please don't hesitate to ask any questions you might have. I'll be more than happy to dive a little bit like deeper into any topics during the Q&A session that we'll have towards the end. And as a reminder, I mean, there's absolutely no silly questions. If you're asking yourself something, I can guarantee you there's at least 10 other people here that are, that have the same interrogation. So don't be shy. Please ask your questions. And yeah, I'll be more than happy to address them towards the end. But yeah, let's jump right in with a lot of learnings from these amazing PLG brands. And so today, really, the topic that we're going to talk about is, yeah, are PQLs the new MQL? And I think that the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because PQLs today seem to be all the rage. Like the recession that we're seeing and the kind of macroeconomic situation seems to be headed in a way that's really pushing board of directors to drive their portfolio CEOs towards more cost-effective acquisition offers. And PLG really has been put in a spotlight because it typically yields a fairly low cost of acquisition with high potential returns. And that really answers like the VC's prayers of, higher efficiency while still supporting a lot of growth. So I think that is one of the reasons why PLG is like such a hot topic right now. And for those who need a quick refresher, of course, like PLG essentially is a strategy that leverages a SaaS product to accelerate a part of the customer lifecycle. And so a component of this strategy, could be potentially to flag high potential for users of the product to try and extract monetary value from them, as well. It could be like either pushing them to sales, or it could be triggering some kind of marketing campaign that's pushing for some kind of conversion. And this kind of rise of PLG and this push from a lot of investors out there for companies to look a little bit more deeply into this PLG topic has led to a flourishing of new MarTech vendors, a lot of which are actually focusing specifically on identifying these PQLs, which are really that kind of like sweet spot in the product lifecycle where people are ready for a sales outreach. And a lot of these new vendors are strongly pushing a narrative by which PQLs are the new MQL, and if that's the case, I think the narrative should go a little bit further and say, well, then if PQLs are actually the new MQL, then we should pivot all of our marketing activities towards generating more PQLs rather than generating MQLs. And so hence the question, are PQLs the new MQL? And in short, in the immortal words of Michael Scott, no, please God, no. I think if there's one thing that I want you to, take away from this session is that is an absolute lie and an absolute oversimplification of what's going on in the market and how to think about your go-to-market motions. Do not think that PQLs are going to replace MQLs and are therefore the new MQL. So that's it for me. Thanks a ton for tuning in. You can follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter, or you can hit me up at francis@madq.com. More happy to share further insights on this. No, more seriously, I think I really insist, if there's one thing you should remember from this, like you can stop the video now and come back for the Q&A, but literally like PQLs are not the new MQL. This is a narrative that's being driven by a lot of folks that have a vested interest in that. And so essentially a lot of companies that, are PQL engines. And, the truth is that because they have this vested interest, they're really pushing towards that. And I think, there's some value in the provocative thinking of, the MQLs are dead and like long live PQLs. And this is like the new way, that's the future. And that's how we should be thinking about go to market. I think one of the big risks that I see here, and one of the reasons why I'm always a little bit wary about this, is that a lot of these narratives are based on theories that actually are false truisms, right? So, for example, when we're looking at some of these companies, they talk about how, they define product qualified leads as, like something different than MQLs. And a lot of the things that I see is that, MQLs are based on like specific kind of attributes, and are based on interactions. I think the challenge here is that MQL should not be something that is defined by marketing content, right? Like MQL is not a lead source. It's not saying, oh, like MQLs are basically anyone that interacts with marketing. No, like the M of MQL is like marketing considers this lead to be qualified enough to be sent over to sell. So really the MQL is like a stage in the life cycle. It's not a lead source. So in that sense, when we start defining, PQLs as differently from MQLs, because like MQLs, like people interacting with marketing, and PQLs are people are interacting with the product, that is like, that's wrong. That's not what MQLs are at the core. And it's very dangerous to go down that narrative, because you start building up the idea of what PQLs should be on top of something that is slightly wrong about what MQLs even are in the first place. And similarly, in a kind of like, I guess, worse definition of why PQLs are the future, I see a lot of vendors that talk about how, salespeople in your more traditional go-to-market process are just about like withholding value, or it's like they're gating value and you have to talk to them to get there. And that again is absolutely incorrect. Sure, there's a lot of reps that are not that great out there and actually do this, and they're kind of, forcing you into talking to them to get access to the product. But, if you've met any successful rep, what you will find is that they are very consultative, and they apply challenger selling, and they literally educate their customers and their prospects and get them to think a little bit beyond where they're at. And that's really what gives them the sale. And so that's a really important element to take in mind, that a lot of these like narratives about PQLs being better than MQLs are based off of like erroneous visions of what, B2B go-to-market teams are today. And I think that's a little bit naive, and it's really dangerous then if you're, taking that and bringing it to your board. You might end up in a slightly poor situation in front of them. But so, like PQL is still in its infancy, right? It's something that is fairly new, that hasn't been like necessarily extremely well documented. And so what I find is that, I often feel like we need to define terms and make sure that we agree on semantics, which is why one of the big things that I believe we should do today is starting with what are MQLs, right? Like, sure, we're going to talk about PQLs, but if we're saying PQLs are the new MQL, let's actually start by defining and reminding ourselves what MQLs are. And what I realize is that a lot of the people that are in marketing today haven't lived through the crystallization of inbound go-to-market terminology that SiriusDecision coined a few years ago. So before we even talk about PQLs, I think it's worth going through a quick reminder of what MQLs are. And at the highest of levels, MQLs were defined and designed as a means of flagging someone ready for a sales touch based on their fit for the product and their inferred intent. And the inferred intent could be based on marketing activities, based on anything that you could get. And so historically, MQLs have really been a great way to measure effectiveness of marketing spend, right? Because you were able to, okay, we're spending X amount of dollars, how many ready for sales leads are we getting out of that? And the idea was to constantly improve that ratio so that you make sure that if you're, constantly spending like $1 million every month to, not just generate leads, but generate leads and warm up leads, like how many MQLs are you getting out of that? Because the MQL was really, okay, we have leads and the marketing spend is like in order to get a bunch of people that are ready to be handed over to sales, because we believe that they're truly ready to have a sales conversation that could lead to an opportunity. And so that's a really important metric. And one of the reasons why MQLs were so prominent, right? Because it allowed for a, fairly good metric of how well are we spending our marketing dollars. And also, this has been like a great, I guess, sales and marketing alignment tool, or marketing as HubSpot used to call it, because one of the things that you could look at is you would say, okay, we have a certain number of MQLs that are being identified by marketing. So marketing, again, saying that these leads are ready for a sales touch. And then sales is either going to accept those leads or reject them. And this SAL to MQL ratio became a metric of alignment, right? It's saying, does sales agree with the fact that these leads are indeed ready for them to reach out to them? And if not, if that ratio goes below a given threshold, now we know that we need to realign our sales and our marketing initiatives to make sure that we're pushing the right kind of people to our sales team. And finally, one of the last elements that one of the last metrics that was built off of this that made a lot of sense is, how many closed $1 do we get out of every MQL? And that becomes a forecasting unit, because now we're able to say, okay, MQLs are fairly up in the funnel, it's fairly early in the life cycle. And we know that typically, one MQL is going to, yield whatever, like $2,000 of revenue. And so now we're able to forecast, a few months out by saying, okay, like we are generating this many MQLs, so we know that it's going to result in this many closed $1. And ultimately, we might even want to improve the sales efficiency engine by saying, okay, if we can increase the closed $1 to MQL ratio, then we have a sales funnel that is becoming better at keeping the value along the funnel. And so with that in mind, I think it's interesting to start looking at what are the typical funnels that inbound companies used to have. And we'll get to PLG, but again, I think it's really important that we look at how we've evolved from inbound to PLG and really understand how inbound models work, so that we can really understand how PLG works. And so in a typical inbound model, what you're going to have is, like, generally you have like really two kinds of MQLs. You're going to have the MQLs that come from hand raisers, so people that are asking to talk to sales, asking for a quote, anything of the sort. And those generally have a really high conversion rate from raising their hand to hand raiser and to creating an opportunity. And on the other hand, you have a lot of MQLs that are campaign responses, people that download your gated content, that join a webinar and like interact with your website, all that kind of stuff, where after like a certain amount of activities, we can infer that their intent is high enough that if a salesperson reaches out to them, there is a high likelihood that that person is going to respond positively to the sales outreach. And so what's interesting here is that the reason why we typically break them in two is that from, like a sales motion perspective, someone who's raising their hand to talk to sales, that's like the most inbound motion you could possibly have, right? Like literally someone is asking to talk to sales. On the flip side, when you're looking at, people downloading content or like these more campaign response MQL types, in this case, the sales motion is more of a warm outbound, right? The rep is going outbound to talk to the person and try and get a response. And so that's actually a distinction that's pretty important, as we'll see later, because of course the conversion rates are very different, right? Of like you reaching out to someone in order to get to book a meeting versus someone knocking at the door saying, hey, I would like to talk pricing. And so what generally happens, like this is like the very typical like inbound funnel for early stage companies. And at some point, companies mature and they start looking for, more predictability in the business and the ability to grow beyond what demand gen can generate in terms of pipeline. And that's when they start like really this cold outbound motion. And in that case, it's going to be, flagging a list of accounts that, the team wants to go after. generating engagement from that account to the point where the account seems to be engaged enough that we can have a sales rep reach out to them and open an opportunity. So again, like a fairly outbound motion. And again, like it could be outbound that's handled by marketing or outbound handled by sales. But so where things become more complex is like when we now add in the PLG layer. So what's really interesting is that a lot of the PLG companies that I was talking about, like these more mature PLG companies, what's really interesting about them is that they have a wide range of go-to-market motions, and you could almost think of it as like each of them has funnels, right? So they run inbound, they run outbound, but they also have a core chunk of like PLG funnels. And so depending on like their different price points, what you will have is a self-serve funnel where it's really about like how do we convert prosumer style users where like the typical ASP is going to be less than $5,000, so it's not worth having a sales rep talk to them. So ideally, we want these people to just like swipe their credit card and move through the funnel themselves. Then for like more of that mid-size ASP, so anything from like 5 to 50K range, that's typically where you want to have a more transactional sales assisted motion on the PLG side, and that's like where a lot of the hype is today on that PLS motion. So it's like product-led sales. It's really like sales-assisted PLG motion where we want to identify users in the product that have shown enough interest through their behavior that we think it warrants having a salesperson reach out to them to try and get them to buy the product rather than use the free version. And so that's where all the rage is nowadays. And then a little bit further, I guess in the ASP land, you have more of that bottom up sales motion where the idea is to either like land a small initial deal or work on the account to get like more active users within the account to the point where it feels like the account is ready to have an enterprise conversion style conversation. Like one of the typical stories I share here is that if you're a collaborative tool, the fact that you have one person from Disney that's super active in your product doesn't mean Disney is ready to sign an enterprise deal. What you want is to get like 10, 20 people from Disney interacting on a regular basis with your product. At that point, potentially, you can consider that the account is ready for a sales outreach and for an enterprise rep to go and try and close them. That's like a pretty important difference that we want to take there. And so what's interesting here, right, is that I've kept kind of I think what today is somewhat of the standard terminology in terms of like what's an MQL, what's a PQL, and what's a PQA. And I think some of the components that are really interesting here is that you start seeing that, MQL already represents like two potentially different things, right? Like hand raisers, again, like this inbound motion and, the outbound motion coming or stemming from people interacting with collateral and things like that. And similarly on the PQL side, what I see is that there's a lot of confusion between like what is a PQL from a self-serve perspective, someone that's ready to get a marketing email to push them to a conversion, as well as like who are the leads that are engaged enough that we think they warrant having a sales rep reach out to them to try and generate a transactional deal. And then there's the PQA land where we're looking at higher level product activity that pushes someone over. And so what this leads to is generally a lot of headaches on the ops side, right? Because now there's like MQLs, there's PQLs, there's PQAs. So it becomes like really complicated to figure out like how do we optimize all of these different things and how do we maintain even like systems that do this. And one of the elements also that will show up in here is that each of these will have different conversion rates, which is like super interesting from a monitoring perspective, but it could also become really confusing from a sales perspective, right? Because you're now having leads that are handed off to you that are going to be MQLs, PQLs, PQAs, MQAs. It's like all these things that now as a rep I have to remember and I have to figure out what they mean. I know they each have like slightly different inherent conversion rates, and it just becomes incredibly confusing. But I think ultimately what this does show to some extent is that literally the one thing that we're doing is like we have a bunch of different offers. Like an offer is like a CTA, if you will, right? You can ask to talk to sales. you can interact with marketing content, you can sign up for the product and use the product. And all of these things are ways to capture intent from, potential prospects out there to get to the point where we feel like, a representative of the account or the account itself is ready for a sales outreach, because we believe that a sales outreach to this person or account will lead to a positive outcome. And so essentially, really what we're doing is, if we go back to the definition of what an MQL is like a lead that is deemed qualified by marketing for a sales outreach, then all of these layers of like MQLs, PQLs, PQAs, and MQAs literally are like fit within the definition of what an MQL should be. And so I guess the thing that I want to leave you with, like, beyond the idea that no, PQLs are not the new MQLs, is like, actually PQLs are a new form of MQLs. And one story that I want to share here is that, this is something that I ended up discussing on one of our podcasts on the PLG Confessions with Ashley, who runs mobs at Asana. She shared in her story, I think, like two really relevant points that stuck with me. The first one was, she mentioned the difficulties that the team encountered getting sales to engage with PQLs. You see, like the sales team was really used to working MQLs, which mainly came from hand raisers at Asana. And so the conversion rate of these hand raisers, MQLs, was really, really high. Like, again, people raising their hand to talk to sales at Asana, high conversion rate. And so when they rolled out PQL, this was the first time that the sales team had to do some form of outbound, right? Because like PQL is like, there's enough engagement with the product that, we think someone from sales should reach out. But so the sales team would be reaching out, but of course it's a much lower conversion rate, because now you're trying to get, someone to respond rather than you're responding to a request to engage. And so the sales team quickly felt like they didn't want to engage with PQLs, right? Because the conversion rate was lower than the MQLs. So they were simply asking the marketing team, hey, why can't we just get more MQLs, right? We don't like PQLs. They convert at a low rate. We want more MQLs. And so I think what was really cool is that what Ashley ended up doing is that she completely just killed the PQL terminology and said, okay, moving forward, everything that's routed to sales is going to be called an MQL. And on the MOP side, we're going to keep track of what was the reason for this lead to be routed to sales. So essentially, was it a hand raiser? Was it an inbound lead that interacted with a lot of content, or was it a product user that reached a given threshold of engagement? And so what was really interesting is that allowed her to report to leadership how these different kind of funnels were performing. And at the same time, it helped, overcome this challenge with adoption from the sales team, because now the sales team was essentially getting, everything was MQLs, and they didn't necessarily have the ability to think of like, oh, like MQLs hand raisers versus MQLs product. Again, like the terminology, to some extent, interestingly, was detrimental to the adoption of PQLs. And so the second interesting fact that she brought up was that when, they were looking at their funnels, and when they were looking at the people that were, being flagged as PQLs, a lot of those folks were also interacting with marketing content, and were actually also MQLing from the standpoint of, strong interaction with the website, joining webinars, looking at documentation. And so essentially what she was saying was that, we tend to represent these funnels of like, like the campaign response MQL and the product user leading to PQL as like two siloed sets of leads and two siloed funnels, but they absolutely aren't. Like, people go from one to the other. Like, people are going to be registering to a webinar, and then they're going to sign up for the product. People signing up for the product are going to register to webinars. And so actually, having this idea of like, we only have like MQLs, made it much easier, because now they didn't have to try and figure out, oh, is this like triggered because of this or because of that? Should we call it differently because it was a product user, so we shouldn't call it an MQL, even though it maybe like got them to be inferred as ready for sales is a bunch of marketing activities, but they're still product users. So you quickly see how like that terminology is detrimental to MOPS efficiency, and to sales adoption. So I thought that was like a really strong story as to why you shouldn't think of like using PQLs as a term, for the sales team. It's maybe something that you can use internally in the MOPS function, or when you're thinking about like how you route things. But ultimately, whatever you route should be a marketing qualified lead. Like marketing deems that this is qualified enough to go to sales. We should stick to that serious decision definition. So moving to another story, or like a similar story, right? But this is like a very, very common story of having these like very different, like different conversion rates, like lower conversion rates on the PQL side that can lead to a lack of adoption from sales. And so this is a story of like something that we worked with Envision on, where what they were seeing is that, like the conversion rates for their MQL, so hand raisers, were really, really good. And they pretty much maxed out on whatever value they could get from these MQLs. Like they were responding on time, they were like customizing the response and personalizing it, and really good SLAs. And so then they started trying to figure out, like, if we need to route more MQLs to sales, we need to start tapping into the product. And so what was really interesting was that these like PQLs, so the product users that were starting to route to sales, they represented a huge chunk of what was getting routed to sales. So here you can see the red bar is essentially what was being routed to sales from product users, and gray was like the hand raiser MQLs. And then this line here, was the conversion rate for the hand raisers, and this line here was the conversion rate for the PQLs. And so what was really interesting is that, of course, the PQLs had a much lower conversion rate because, again, like you're going outbound, trying to reach out to them. So this idea that like PQLs are going to have a higher conversion rate than your MQLs is like very, very often wrong. And unfortunately, PQLs like typically have, a fairly low conversion rate, or a conversion rate that's like similar to your campaign response style MQLs. But again, because MQLs are generally like a combined definition in a lot of companies, again, for this like hand raisers and campaign response, that's going to push the conversion rate up. So again, it is very typical that PQLs will have a lower conversion rate than your hand raisers, and just another reason to not call them differently, because otherwise you're going to break the trust, and potentially, like, reps are going to start having a disbelief in the fact that they can get any meaningful pipeline and value from product leads. And this is, again, like a very common pitfall to scaling PLG motions that we've seen through and that we've seen with, many of our customers. And yeah, the first one is what I just mentioned a couple of times, right? Like getting meetings with like product leads is difficult, right? Again, you're going outbound, they're already using your product. So you have to figure out what is a value proposition that's strong enough for them to actually pick up the phone and want to talk to you. So you can't just, be, again, like the whole thing of like, oh, you're gating value in like the traditional sense of saying, oh, like, you have to talk to me to see the product. That it's fairly true. But again, like the good reps are always selling value. But I think in the case of going after product leads, there is no way that you can talk to someone if you don't show that you can deliver value to them. So I think it sets the bar a little bit higher, which is awesome, because we want reps to be providing value in their outreach. There's an element here, the second part, which is kind of what I covered very, very briefly when we were looking at the multiple funnels. It is really critical that your sales team doesn't go after self-serve leads. And that means if you go for, if your reps are trying to close things that are going to be, that have an ASP of less than, 3K or 5K, the economics are not going to work. And your CAC is going to explode, because now you're deploying reps against these like low LTV leads. And that's just, really, really dangerous. And again, that leads, as I just mentioned, right, to like CAC kind of, exploding if you have reps reach out to those. And so the final, story that I want to share with you when it relates to PQLs also is that and this is more towards the idea that the funnels are, when we think of the funnels as being siloed, is there's this very dangerous conceived idea that, PLG is a very linear model, right? So you have new people who sign up for the product, you help them get value from it. Your customer is now activated. They've reached like the activation metric. Then, you help them achieve recurring value within the product. And now they're like engaged. And now it's about like trying to figure out how to, monetize and like help them convert. And now they're a paying customer and everyone is happy. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. I mean, again, like the objective of models is to simplify reality so that we have a common framework to improve things. And I think this is helpful to get a sense for how we can improve onboarding, where we want to say, okay, like the onboarding has to be valuable enough and frictionless enough that we can get people from signing up to paying. But the journey to get there is often way more complicated because, again, we don't operate in B2C where it's like single user product. We operate in B2B, where very, very frequently we're talking about multiple users within an account and therefore multiple users using the product. And so one of the things that we see very frequently is that, a new user isn't necessarily going to be activated. There are new users that sign up and then start inviting more people. And then those new people that were invited to the instance are going to be the ones that become activated. And we're also going to have sometimes new users that just sign up and actually swipe the credit card. And this is very, very standard and something that we see very frequently, right? So if we take the example of Miro, that was like, talking to us about this, and we worked with them on this. One of the things that they would see is that there's, sometimes there's going to be the manager of a team that's going to sign up and like create a Miro instance and is going to invite all their team members. And then the team members are the ones that actually interact with Miro and go in and like do the work. And the manager isn't necessarily ever going to be active in the product. And so this isn't a failure per se, right? We don't need necessarily that initial sign up to go all the way to becoming a paying customer. If that person now invites a bunch of users and those users activate and become engaged customers, that's good enough. And the other story that they would see pretty frequently is that there would be a bunch of people using the product and very happy, and like someone would get invited and that person would be the one swiping the credit card. Very, very typical in like a startup organization, right? Where like the team is using it and they either reach a threshold of usage or, they go tell the founder, hey, I think, it's something that we should have the entire team use. And then the founder just signs up, swipes a credit card, and then the whole team keeps on using it. And potentially the founder never really activates it. And there's a third version of this that I think is even more complicated, where what they started realizing is that most of the revenue at Miro was coming from hand raisers. Okay, makes a lot of sense, right? Like people would say, hey, I want to talk about your enterprise pricing. Yes, they're going to be the ones that generate the bulk of their revenue, and they have a super high conversion rate. And so for the longest time, the conversations with the marketing team was, hey, marketing, we need you to generate more hand raisers. We don't really know where these people are coming from, but it's awesome, right? They want to talk about enterprise pricing, and then they buy a bunch of seats. And the interesting thing was that these people that were raising their hands were actually not product users. So it started like sparking the question of like, is the product really even helpful? Because the people that generate the bulk of the revenue are hand raisers. These hand raisers are not product users. So why do we even have any kind of like free trial or whatnot if, we could just get people to raise their hand? And so what they found out was that, they kind of, again, in the concept, like we're B2B, we're not B2C. They started looking at this from the account perspective. And what they realized was that, yes, the person who was raising their hand was not a product user, but they were a bunch of people using the product within that organization. And so what was interesting was that there was a lot of momentum that was gained within the organization using the product. And that led someone, and this was like very often like someone either from procurement or like CFO, like within the finance or G&A organization, to raise their hand to buy the enterprise plan. But that person was never a product user. And so again, what was really interesting here is that there's like different, ways of approaching this idea of a PQL. And what was interesting, I guess, like what we're saying here is that PQL, so people like highly engaged with the product, would generate an MQL, someone that was not a PQL that came and requested a demo and then led to, a paying customer. And so really what I want to flag again, I know I've repeated this quite a bit, but the idea is that you should think of PQLs as a new MQL, like people highly engaged with the product that you think are so engaged that it warrants having a salesperson reach out to them, is a new form of marketing, considering that these people are qualified enough to have a sales conversation. And so I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of noise out there. As I said, there are vendors that have a vested interest in you thinking that PQLs are the new hot thing, that you should buy a like PQL engine, and that like PQL is the future. And ultimately, I think I'll use this like quote from Dave Gerard, which if you don't know, he was like one of the first marketers at Drift and really helped them with the brand there. And I think for the longest time, he was like, pushing against things like lead scoring and things like that, because his point was that at the end of the day, like, forget about all the acronyms, forget about all these like complex concepts, because you can easily get lost in them. It gets so confusing of like, oh, PQLs, MQAs, SQLs, SALs, like all of that stuff. And ultimately, what you should think about is like, what is the customer journey? Like how do we want people to engage with our brand to get them to the point where they're ready to have a meaningful monetary conversation? And there are multiple ways people will get to that point. Some people want to test your product. Some people want to read about it. Some people want to hear customer stories in webinars. And it's really important that you embrace that kind of like first principle approach of saying, like, at the end of the day, as marketers, what we need to do is understand what the customer journey is and figure out how do we make that customer journey frictionless. And then there's different places where we can optimize. But the whole things of like MQLs and all that stuff, they're supposed to be a way to help us, think and align the organization. And like, they're a measurement tool. They're nothing more than that. And so at the end of the day, it's really like design that customer journey, figure out what the milestones are, and then identifying those milestones should be a measurement tool and nothing more. So hopefully this was helpful, and will help you figure out how to get your PLG motion going, and hopefully it just makes it a little bit simpler, and you don't have to go into like buying a bunch of tools and like thinking about like all these different triggers and whatnot. And we spend a lot of time doing this. Like, as I mentioned, right, I've been fortunate enough to work with a couple hundred B2B PLG companies, and I've seen companies like MongoDB go from like being a pure like enterprise company to embracing PLG, and what that change meant, and like how they went through this. And so we've put a lot of thought into this, and we've documented a lot of this. So if you want to learn more, I'd highly recommend you hit us up on MadKudu. Like, we have a ton of content that you can download and interact with. We have podcasts where we get awesome PLG companies to talk about their struggles, how they overcame it, and what they've done. And you can also like reach out to have a conversation with us. We're always more than happy to have those conversations and dive a little bit deeper into the world of PLG. So that's it for me. It was a pleasure having you. We'll jump into the Q&A. So please don't be shy. As I said, if you have a question, I can guarantee a lot of people are asking themselves the same question. So yeah, let's jump into Q&A, and thanks again for listening. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from all of you folks.